The room had gone silent except for one man's voice, and General Bradshaw's finger was an inch from Captain Elena Reyes's face when he said the words that would follow him for the rest of his career. No woman runs this squad. Behind him, a dozen soldiers stood frozen, afraid to breathe. Reyes didn't blink, and outside that splintered door, something was already running toward them, fast. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love knowing who's listening. Elena Reyes had spent 11 years earning the right to stand in that room. She'd buried friends, carried wounded men twice her weight across open ground, and never once asked for the room to go easier on her. She didn't need it to. What she needed, standing there under the fluorescent hum of that briefing room, was for one stubborn old general to stop seeing a uniform and finally see a soldier. Bradshaw didn't see that yet. His face was red, his voice cracked with the particular fury of a man who'd built his whole world on certainty, and now that world was being questioned by someone half his age and, in his mind, the wrong gender entirely. She thought she'd never get him to listen. She was wrong, though not yet, not in the way she expected. The tension in that room had been building for weeks, ever since Reyes had been handed command of the K-9 unit, a posting that made the older officers shift in their seats and mutter just loud enough to be heard. Bradshaw had fought it from the start. He'd seen war the old way, men in trenches, men giving orders, men dying for other men. A woman leading a unit with live dogs and live ammunition didn't fit the picture he'd carried since Vietnam, and pictures like that don't update easily in a mind that's spent decades being right. Dust hung in the slanted light pouring through the doorway behind them, and somewhere outside, beyond the broken frame of that door, a low growl had started. Almost too quiet to notice, almost swallowed by Bradshaw's shouting. Almost. Reyes felt her pulse in her throat. Not fear. Something closer to grief. Grief that after everything, after every mission, every scar, every night she hadn't slept because the weight of command sat on her chest like a stone, it still came down to this. A man's finger in her face, a room full of witnesses too afraid to say a word. That was the moral weight of the moment, and it sat heavy in every soldier's chest. Because some of them agreed with Bradshaw, quietly, in the part of themselves they'd never admit out loud. And some of them were ashamed of staying silent. Right and wrong weren't always a clean line. Sometimes they were a room full of people choosing comfort over courage, and choosing it together. Reyes opened her mouth to respond. Calm, measured, the words she'd rehearsed 100 times in her head for a moment exactly like this one. She never got to say them. The door behind her exploded inward in a storm of splintered wood and sunlight, debris hanging suspended in the air like the whole world had taken a breath and forgotten how to let it out. And through that wreckage came Titan, 90 pounds of muscle and loyalty, teeth bared, eyes locked not on Reyes, not on the frightened soldiers, but on the general who'd raised his voice loud enough to sound like a threat. For one full second, nobody moved. The room seemed to hang suspended with the dust. Every soldier's breath caught somewhere between their chest and their throat. Bradshaw's hand, still raised, still pointing, began very slightly to tremble. Reyes didn't shout a command. She didn't need to. She raised one open palm, slow and certain, and said a single quiet word that cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. Easy. Titan's body lit through the air in one fluid motion, then planted itself at her side. Not the general's, hers, a wall of muscle and breath standing exactly where she stood, exactly as she'd trained him to. Not attacking, guarding. The difference mattered more than anyone in that room understood in the moment, but they would. Bradshaw lowered his hand. For the first time since he'd walked into that room, his voice was gone. What he saw wasn't a woman who needed protecting. What he saw was a leader whose unit, animal and human alike, moved in instant, total trust around her. The way real command always looks when you finally see it without your assumptions standing in the way. The soldiers behind him exhaled together, a single ragged breath of release that seemed to lift the dust hanging in the light. Somewhere near the back, someone began, quietly, to clap. Then another. Then the whole room, not in celebration, but in something quieter and more honest, recognition. Bradshaw stood there a long moment, his pride and his eyes fighting two different battles. Then, slowly, the general who had built his career on certainty did something none of them expected. He lowered his arm fully, looked Reyes directly in the eye, and said only, "Stand down your dog, Captain. I was wrong." It wasn't an apology wrapped in ceremony. It was 4 words, plain and unpolished, the kind that cost a proud man everything to say, and meant more for exactly that reason. Because respect doesn't arrive with applause. It arrives quietly, earned one hard moment at a time, and once it's been earned, it never needs to be loud again. And maybe that's the real story here. Not the dog crashing through that door, not the general's pride breaking in front of his men, but the second right before it, when a woman who'd been doubted her whole career chose calm over rage and command over chaos. The door behind them still hung open, dust drifting through the light, debris settling slowly to the floor, and in that stillness, something had finally changed for good. If this story moved you, tell me below what part stayed with you the longest. And if you believe respect should be earned, not assumed, hit subscribe. There's another story waiting, and I'd love to share it with you next.